Raj Persaud, and I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in London. And I'm joined today by Katherine Keyes, who is an assistant professor of epidemiology at Columbia University in New York. And today we're going to be discussing a paper published by her and several colleagues, and the paper has been published in the American Journal of Psychiatry and is entitled "The Burden of Loss: Unexpected Death of a Loved One and Psychiatric Disorders Across the Life Course in a National Study." So, Katherine, first of all, let me start by asking you, what do you mean by unexpected death of a loved one? What are you referring to by that title?
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me on the program. We consider unexpected death sudden death. So examples would include homicide, suicide, death of a loved one in a motor vehicle crash, fatality, for example. Anything that was acute and unexpected would fall under that category.
And by loved one, you mean people like wives, brothers, sisters, girlfriends, boyfriends?
That is left a bit more ambiguous in our study because we leave it up to the respondents to define what a loved one is. Certainly, people like spouses, parents, children would fall under the rubric of loved one, and then beyond that, it would be your appraisal of that person's proximity to you. You know, for example, someone's cousin could be someone near and dear, or it could be someone they see once every few years, and so your appraisal of that person's closeness to you is what's important.
Now, when people talk about stressful life events, they often say things like divorce and moving house. But actually, unexpected death of a loved one probably is the most stressful experience any of us are going to encounter. Isn't that right?
Well, what we documented, and I was actually very surprised by this, so in the study that we conducted, we assessed about 20 different potential traumatic experiences that would include breakup of a romantic relationship, and even very severe types of events such as physical assault or sexual assault. And so we asked respondents if they had experienced these types of events over their lives, and then we asked them what was worst for them. Which of these events was the worst thing that they experienced? And no matter how many stressful life experiences the respondents reported, unexpected death of a loved one, when it occurred, was most frequently reported as the worst event in the respondent's life. Even if they had experienced, we went up to 5, 6, 7, 8 different types of potentially traumatic experiences, and still unexpected death of a loved one was most often rated the worst thing that the respondent experienced.
And despite the fact this is the worst thing that can happen to you, there actually isn't an enormous amount of research on this issue.
Yeah, there is a lot of research on bereavement experiences and grief experiences and how that might translate into psychological distress. And certainly, it is one of the most profound experiences of the human condition. Losing someone very close to you, those attachment figures, it has a profound effect on your sense of self and your sense of identity, and there's been a lot of research in that area.
So the other important thing about this study is its sheer size. This is a massive study. In the abstract, you mentioned analytic sample size 27,534. Could you say something about the sheer size of the study?
Yes. So it was a very large study of the general population in the U.S. And so we did a representative sample of individuals in the U.S. And so, we were able to survey a huge number of people. We did face-to-face interviews with them. So a trained interviewer was asking them questions from a structured clinical interview. So we had very good reliability across respondents in terms of all the measures that we were assessing. And what was really novel about the study was that what we were very much interested in was whether we knew that losing a loved one is psychologically distressing and is associated with psychiatric disorders. But what we were really interested in is whether those responses differed across disorder type and differed across the life course. So if you lost a loved one in childhood, for example, did that have a different association with the onset of psychiatric disorders if you lost someone when you were an established adult with presumably greater social network? And what we found was really that losing a loved one has a profound effect on the onset of numerous psychiatric disorders across the life course. Certainly in childhood, but also in adulthood. A first onset of a wide variety of mood and anxiety disorders and also substance disorders. These disorders onset in the wake of losing a loved one unexpectedly throughout the life course, and we even found that among older adults, one of the most surprising findings was that people 50 and 60 and older will experience the first onset of a psychiatric disorder after losing a loved one unexpectedly later in life.
And the other really interesting thing is the particular disorders that seem to occur. There's certain disorders that cluster around the unexpected loss of a loved one, and these were PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, panic, depression, and particularly interesting to me is the first onset of mania, or a manic episode.
Right.
Could you say something about this last finding, because this is particularly intriguing?
Sure. Yeah. So this has a long history in the psychiatric literature in terms of clinical case reports. There have been numerous case reports of what's called funeral mania, and so it's manic episodes that first onset, or there's no history of sort of mania, and then in the wake of bereavement, someone will experience a manic episode during the bereavement period for a loved one. And so there have been these case reports, but it had never been documented in a general population sample. And so we were intrigued as well by the findings that, we documented first onset of manic episodes and mania following the unexpected death of a loved one, and those rates were elevated quite consistently across the life course.
And by mania, we should perhaps explain that what we mean by that is a condition whereby people experience elevated mood, they can develop quite grandiose ideas, they speak
Correct.
very fast, they have racing thoughts, they have trouble sleeping, their appetite goes up, they can get quite flirtatious, they're
acting out,
promiscuous.
Exactly, and certainly, in the case reports, that have been documented, there's everything that you've mentioned, and then there's also, excessive spending, gambling, sort of just acting out, and, behavioral disinhibition more broadly, I think is what's been characterized in the literature in terms of these kind of manic episodes after losing a loved one unexpectedly.
And what I think is very interesting about your study, one of the many things about this very interesting study, is that to some extent we would expect people to get PTSD, post-traumatic stress, or panic, or depression. The mania finding is the more difficult one to explain. Could you say anything about the theories, about how you'd explain why people go manic or go high after the unexpected loss of a loved one?
What I would say was that it is an intriguing finding to document in the general population, but we see case reports of this going back to the 19th century, where, this phenomenon known as funeral mania, it's been documented in literature, and people who have just these sort of psychodynamic disturbances in the wake of losing, when you lose someone who is a central figure to you, it's a loss of identity and it's a loss of sense of self, because oftentimes for those who we are attached to, our closest loved ones, our sense of identity are wrapped up in those individuals, and so once we lose them, we no longer have a sense of self. And I think for some individuals, and certainly, it's not the majority of individuals in our study, the majority of individuals in our study did not experience any type of psychological disturbance in the wake of a loved one. They had normal bereavement and grief reactions. But for a subset of people, these losses of key attachment figures do render vulnerability to the development of these disorders, some of which include responses that are manic and induce these sort of manic episodes.
And that's a very important point you're making, that it's not the case necessarily that the majority of people who suffer
Right.
this terrible stress end up in trouble psychologically. Now, I know your study wasn't really about resilience, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about the fact that, in fact, many people experience terrible things but don't end up with psychiatric disturbance.
Yeah, and
There's
I would
something that's
say,
making them resilient.
right, and I would point out that unexpected loss of a loved one was the most frequent event that was endorsed among the potentially traumatic events that we cited. So more than 40% of our sample lost someone unexpectedly in their lives, which points to the universality of this kind of human condition of losing people who are close to you. That is something that we all experience during our lives. And losing someone unexpectedly is not a rare event by any means. And so I think that it is a vulnerable period for a subset of people that needs to be watched closely for the onset of potentially distressing thoughts and distressing experiences and distressing behaviors. But certainly we don't want to pathologize bereavement or pathologize grief. These are normal parts of the human condition, and we all experience those when we lose loved ones. But for a subset of people, it really is a vulnerable period and sort of a reservoir of risk for the onset of these really troubling symptoms.
So we're running out of time a little bit, and there may be something else you want to say, or other comment you may want to make about an important finding that we haven't touched on. So I'll let you think about that a bit before I ask you one of my final questions, which is that this was not a study whereby you had direct contact with people and could interview them in depth about their personal experiences. The sheer size of it mitigated against that. But I'm wondering about how it changed you in terms of any people that were close to you who've had unexpected loss of a loved one, how it changed your approach to this subject, or did it have a personal impact on you, this study?
I think that when I haven't fortunately lost a loved one in the time that I've been doing this research, but I encounter friends and people close to me who have experienced losses of a loved one, and I on one hand, you don't want to be the researcher who, when your friend has lost a close relative, to say, like, I've done some research on this and here's what I found. You don't want to bring your professional life into those kind of personal interactions. But on another hand, I think that I can relate a lot better and certainly counsel someone through these types of experiences, having a foundation in the history of this literature and in the current state of the literature in a way that I certainly hadn't before. So I think that it's profoundly impacted my empathy for my friends and loved ones who experience these types of events.
What about the future for you and your relationship to this subject? What's the future hold in terms of further research on this issue?
So in this study, we weren't able to assess what's known as complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, or this kind of broad syndrome that's still being characterized in the literature of grief and bereavement that is very much prolonged and does not resolve. Certainly we think of grief and bereavement whenever you lose someone as natural to the human condition. And these are intense and acute and very distressing periods in everyone's life, but they resolve. For a subset of people, they don't, and they develop a set of symptoms that tend to be prolonged and very distressing for a long period of time. And they've been known by numerous names, and it's still kind of under a debate over what to call this kind of constellation of symptoms, but complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder is typically some of the names that have been used. And so the epidemiology of those types of disorders, when you lose a loved one, whether unexpectedly or not, but especially unexpectedly, and you just can't get over it. You just have these prolonged symptoms of yearning, of loss, of inability to move on, preoccupation with thoughts of the person for, sometimes years and years. And so the epidemiology of those types of disorders has not been appropriately characterized, and understanding the comorbidity with other disorders is certainly the next step in this research that we want to pursue.
And how are you going to pursue that, and what do you think you might find?
So we're attempting to conduct epidemiological studies, get out in the community. What is unknown is the burden of these types of disorders in the community. We see a lot of people clinically who have these type problems, but they're only the people who come to clinical attention. There have been very few population-based epidemiological studies to understand what the prevalence is in the population, how disabling it is for people who don't come to clinical attention, and what types of disorders are often comorbid with it, what types of stressful events are often comorbid with it, and how it affects the course of people's lives. So it's really an open area of research that we don't really know that much about. So that's what we're interested in pursuing next.
And that kind of is the importance and the power of epidemiology, because if you don't go out and do epidemiology, which is go out and look in the world and see what's really happening, as opposed to assuming the world is represented by people who walk in through the clinic door,
Correct.
which was a fatal error that doctors made in the past. They
Right.
assumed that what they saw in their clinic represented the world, and
Correct.
epidemiology reveals what
Right.
the world is really like. And could you say something in conclusion then about that power of epidemiology, why it's so important?
I think what we have found time and time again is that, the clinic really is the classic, what we call in epidemiology as the iceberg phenomenon. So that the people you see in the clinic are the tip of the iceberg, and they're the most severe cases, and they're the people who need the most care, and that's who should be coming into the clinic. Absolutely, but they are the tip of the iceberg, and beneath those waters are a whole plethora of people who are suffering and who have symptoms, and it requires a concentrated effort to go out into the community and develop measures and assess people for a wide range of potential problems in order to fully understand the burden of psychiatric disorders in multiple populations. And when we have done that, we have fully seen, the extent to which the individuals who come into contact with treatment are only a small subset of individuals in the community who might benefit from the effective treatments that are available.
So epidemiology is crucial to the planning of services, because if you didn't go out and find that there's a large number of people who probably need help, but for various reasons don't go and get help, you need to do that, to find that out, in order to try and set about trying to meet that need.
Right. Certainly. Although the identification of people who need help does not necessarily translate to funding for those types of services, depending on the community and the situation, and the impetus for people who have these types of problems to seek treatment. So that also remains an active area of research, is not only promoting people who have disorders and feel stigma to seek treatment, or are reluctant to seek treatment for other reasons, to avail themselves of services, but then to build capacity in order to accommodate people who might need these services as well.
So you could almost say, and I appreciate that you may find this an unfair question, there's a kind of political dimension to epidemiology. Epidemiologists risk courting unpopularity because they often point out that governments aren't doing enough. They're often pointing out a gap between the need and what's provided.
I don't know that I can speak to that entirely. I don't know how much governments pay attention to what we identify as the gap. So as of yet, I think what epidemiologists do is document the burden of disorders in the community, and what you've seen globally increasingly globally in terms of global mental health is that there's a huge chasm between the people who have not only psychiatric disorders but very disabling psychiatric disorders and the unmet need for treatment. And so I think the structural calls in terms of what's needed not only fall on governments but also fall on other types of community structures in order to build capacity to treat individuals. I don't think it's only a governmental issue at all. But certainly, what epidemiologists do is go out in the community and document the problem. And beyond that, I agree there are multiple kind of political and social forces that need to be melded to what we document in the community.
So one really, really final question, which is psychiatric epidemiology has a special force because maybe with other things like heart attacks or other disorders, it's more likely that people who have the condition are going to come forward. Maybe with psychiatric disorders, because that's maybe less likely for a variety of reasons, psychiatric epidemiology has a special force.
Certainly what we've documented epidemiologically across a wide range of disorders, that the stigma associated with having a psychiatric disorder is larger than the stigma associated with having a lot of different disorders. And this isn't always historically been true. The stigma associated with having something like cancer used to be much greater than it is now. This isn't a truism, but today, as we see it today, the stigma of having a psychiatric disorder, and it depends on the type of psychiatric disorder, is huge, and that is a huge barrier to people seeking treatment. I think psychiatric epidemiology has a particular call to go out in the community and document cases as they occur in the community in order to observe the extent of the burden of these disorders, because such a low percentage of people with the disorders actually avail themselves of services.
Katherine Keyes, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.